Before Jews even existed, hatred and slaughter waited for us for thousands of years. From Masada to Munich, we've been massacred. Pharaohs, popes, and princes, and popular votes calling for our blood. Now, we survived the war. We survived the greatest mass eradication in modern history. And we arrive home to find are the people who did this to us. They're our neighbors. So tell me, what should we do? Shake hands? Turn a blind eye? Forget? No. The greatest single gift of the Jewish people is our capacity to remember. And it's because of our memory that we know this is survival. This is not murder. This is mitzvah.
Yeah, but the guy giving that speech turns out to be a Nazi. Kind of ruins the whole thing for me.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
What's up, world, and welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like. iMixWhatILike.org, at I Mix What I Like for all your relevant social media. Again, I'm Jared Ball. And ultimately, that is how I felt at the conclusion of watching the series Hunters. And as I warned in the title, there would be some spoilers. Those were the words of Meyer Offerman, played by Al Pacino, the head of the Hunters, a group of Jews and comrade allies, one sister and one Asian, who assassinate Nazis in the 1970s in New York, surrounding areas, in, of course, response to the Nazi Holocaust of World War II. But by having Offerman, Al Pacino's character, Meyer Offerman, turn out to be a Nazi who first in the death camps tortures and brutalizes and then kills Meyer Offerman, then has surgery done to his face to assume the look of Offerman and the full identity of Offerman, leads the post-World War II life of Offerman to escape persecution as a Nazi, and then, as it turns out, to in some way atone for those traumas and horrors inflicted, becomes the lead or the leader of this group of hunters and kills a handful of Nazis in retribution. So in the end, much like Schindler's List, if there is a savior of Jews, it is, of course, a Gentile and a German, and in this case, a Nazi. Now, again, like Queen and Slim, I enjoyed that the context of even my criticism is revolutionary violence and retribution of a different kind, an agency of a different kind, a response of a different kind, a payback of a different kind, displayed cinematically with skill, talent, and entertainment. So on some level, I would hope, and certainly want to, in my own way, use that as a basis from which to make some other, maybe make some other points, raise some other questions. Like, how often do we see commercial media show us revolutionary violence, or that is, organized violence in support of a political movement waged by the oppressed or the colonized or a lesser powerful group against a dominant group? Now, and this is where I think things get a little more tricky and why I think critical media literacy is so important. First, of course, Hunters is produced by Monkey Paw Productions, which is Jordan Peele's company. And as I pointed out before, I think it's important to note again how often lately, to the extent that we get anything meaningful or substantive regarding race or class, it has to be couched in a sort of horror comedy genre of filmmaking or storytelling. It's almost like on the one hand, you have to laugh to keep from crying, and on the other hand, contemporary reality, never mind some of this history being discussed, is so horrific that this is the only method for conveying anything substantive about these histories or stories. So one point is that even with the relationship and the history and the positions held by Jews within Hollywood and commercial media, stories of revolutionary violence, armed rebellion, resistance are never told. And that this, for me, is part of the overriding, superseding politics and ideological purpose and function that media are meant to play. Specific ownership, race, gender, ethnic, religious ownership, or relative positions of power within the industry are largely irrelevant given the broader ideological/commercial, which is often interwoven, interests involved. Ideologically, in this case in particular, there is a disincentive to promote histories of radical armed resistance or revolutionary violence among oppressed or colonized people, even in this case among Jews resisting Nazis during the Nazi Holocaust. Part of this history is outlined in the classic work of Neil Gabler. We'll link to that in the post to this podcast, of course, at iMixWhatILike.org. But as it's described in this other piece, to which we'll also link in the post to this podcast at iMixWhatILike.org, there is a, quote, Western mythology of the Holocaust. The notion of the Jews as universally passive victims who did not resist their own destruction. This image is amplified in the sentimental portrayals of the Holocaust in so much of our film and media, in which the Jewish victims of the Nazi killing machine are urban, intellectual, and assimilated city people who would never own a gun or fight back, end quote. So what ends up happening, as this piece also points out, is that the more than 100 instances, at times armed, but otherwise efforts at resistance to that Nazi killing machine, led by or engaged by or supported by Jews, are never told. So one example in a piece we'll also link to in the post to this podcast at iMixWhatILike.org is a comment by Pierre Sauvage, and I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. But he points out that one of the lies told as to why these stories about resistance or other efforts to combat Nazis engaged by Jews are never told is that Jews were not aware, of course, that even a Holocaust was going on, or the severity of it, or that Jews in the diaspora, in particular here in the United States, were unaware or didn't want to be aware or just could not have known. And this is one of the reasons why similar or different forms of stories are never told. Sauvage says the biggest lie is that we didn't know. It's possible, I suppose, for some rancher in Montana who wasn't reading the press or listening to the radio maybe not to know, but it was massively present. God, this question goes in so many directions. When you think of movies that come out like Woody Allen's Radio Days, what is Woody Allen's Radio Days about? A happy childhood in Brooklyn, in a Jewish family during the years of the Holocaust. Or Lost in Yonkers, which is a Pulitzer Prize-winning play by Neil Simon having nothing to do with the Holocaust. Wonderful play, by the way, but it's like Hitler is totally removed from the frame of reference. This is nonsense. This is absolute nonsense. Woody Allen's parents, Woody may not realize it, but Woody Allen's parents were in the bedroom scared to death about what was happening to their relatives in Europe. So that is the biggest lie, end quote. So yes, there is the broader concern of what Hollywood or what Jews in media were or are or have been saying about Jews during the Nazi Holocaust. But another layer is, to what extent do those stories that do get told include the, again, more than 100 instances of armed struggle engaged or some form of rebelliousness against Nazis engaged by Jews? Now, Sauvage isn't making the point I'm making about the politics of film or media, but he is raising important questions about not only who does the storytelling, but what frames, politics, and biases are brought to bear on those stories being told. Now, again, Gabler's work and the work of others will help in terms of broadening anyone's understanding of why individual or collective or communities of Jews would make the decisions that they were making or are making in terms of the films or media product they support. The assimilationist, white supremacist, Eurocentric, conservative political aspirations included. But again, for me, the more relevant point, particularly as it pertains to this discussion of hunters, is that the form of memory being brought to even a story that centers variations of revolutionary violence adhere to what I would argue are the most important ideological precepts of commercial media, specifically a near full omission of histories of revolutionary violence. Again, this is similar to my both praise for Queen and Slim for bringing in the context of revolutionary violence to discussions of blackness and race in the United States and police violence, etc. But it's the same concept. In all of the stories about enslavement or police violence or black suffering or civil rights, human rights struggles, we are never exposed to the realities of armed self-defense, armed struggle, or the various ways in which Black people have engaged in unsanctioned forms of combat and resistance. So as I've said again about Queen and Slim, it would have been great for the context to have also included that Queen and Slim were comrades in a political organization who were engaged in armed self-defense as part of a conscious political struggle. That could be dramatized or fictionalized in the contemporary moment, or it could be made more dramatically, historically real if it just reflected, for instance, the more than 50 documented examples of armed self-defense engaged in by the Black Liberation Army just between the 1970s and 80s in my own lifetime, documented by political prisoner Jalil Montequin in We Are Our Own Liberators, his book, We Are Our Own Liberators. So again, just as an example, this is not about advocating this sort of activity. This is not about promoting it. It is simply about what stories and what forms of stories are told and what are the politics of commercial media and why we wouldn't, or why those in power, why those who benefit most financially and politically from our media environment would not want these stories to be included. I mean, it's often fascinating that when we consider just how much Jews are involved and have been involved in Hollywood, that we don't hear about the amount of armed self-defense and resistance to Nazi oppression in which Jews had been engaged, including the fact that even Nazis nominally blame an act of revolutionary violence for their enacting Kristallnacht and in sparking off the so-called final solution, where in 1938, Herschel Greenspan, again, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that name correctly, decided to assassinate a German politician who had been advocating the extermination of Jews. So again, while there's this often attempt to promote docile Jews willing to be, herded off by the, thousands and millions to the death camps, to the death chambers, there is even a hesitance among Jews to tell the story of Jews resisting in armed self-defensive violence against Nazi perpetrators. So speaking of another political prisoner, I often come back to the work of Russell Maroon Schultz, who, writing from within the prison walls, has raised in his own work, Maroon the Implacable, the question of how we define violence. And I think his point deserves to be raised again in relationship to this question of hunters, not only in terms of the righteousness of the question of revenge or armed self-defense, but the question of how is violence actually prevented. And as Schultz points out, scientifically, we should look at politics the same way we look at science. That is, as he appropriates Newton's laws of physics to say that emotion can't, once a body is set in motion, it can't be redirected until met with a body moving in equal and opposite force. He says, Schultz, that is, says that the actual opposite to violence is not peace or the absence of violence. The opposite of violence is counter-violence. And that, in other words, politically, the best way to prevent violence is to be willing to meet it with equal and opposite force. Now, again, this is not about promoting it. It is about raising it as a concept for consideration, given not only the way the world has gone historically, but the way the world is going today. But in terms of analyzing in critical media literacy, what kinds of stories we get in our commercial popular media, and in this case regarding the story of hunters, which takes some loosely based historical realities, but then I think ultimately couches them safely within the broader ideological need of commercial media in this country not to be seen as promoting revolutionary violence. So you strip this series away by its end by having the lead Jew, Meyer Offerman, the lead hunter of Nazis, turn out to be himself a Nazi, hiding himself, having assumed the identity of a Jew he formerly tortured, abused, and then killed. All done, as he says, to atone for the violence he inflicted in some way by meting it out upon his fellow Nazis after the fact. So for me, as much as I found the series entertaining, this political reality of the series diminishes its overall value, which I do have to say includes, again, centering the concept of revolutionary violence at all, even from my own criticism. So I appreciated doing that, much as I said about Queen and Slim. I appreciate the fact that they mention Operation Paperclip, the very real operation of the United States government to bring Nazis by the thousands in after World War II, to work within all manner of state apparatus in operation to enhance and support U.S. imperialism and dominance in post-World War II era. And again, by the other big reveal by series end, having it be shown that Hitler survived the war and is in fact alive, I think works both in terms of setting up season 2 and following the Operation Paperclip, even conspiracy theory storyline. But I think more importantly, in terms of our media criticism here, it offers a perfect metaphor for the Nazi ideology that has remained persistent within American politics through to this day. I also like, by the way, that the series shows more accurately that it was the Russians who liberated the Nazi death camps and not the Americans, and that it was the Russians who bore the brunt of that war and who fought earliest and hardest against Hitler, given that they, unlike the United States, did not have so many business interests involved. So they did not have Disney and Ford all involved in supporting the Nazi war machine, which Hunters does talk a little bit about to their credit. So I appreciate that as well. But ultimately, this issue of revolutionary violence, the monopoly of violence, I think shows Hunters to be in most direct service to the broader ideological commitments of commercial mass media here in the United States. And of course, as we pointed out previously, Netflix is happy to follow that mode of operation as well.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.